Margaret O'Sullivan sat on the hard wooden seat of the supply wagon and watched the endless prairie roll by. The hot sun beat down on her dark blue dress, and dust covered everything around her. She pulled her bonnet lower to shade her face and tried not to think about what she had left behind in Boston. 3 weeks ago, she had been living in her father's house on Beacon Hill. 3 weeks ago, she thought she would marry Edmund Harwick, the banker her father had chosen for her. 3 weeks ago, she had no idea she would find the courage to run away. But here she was, traveling west to Colorado Territory with nothing but 2 small bags and the teaching papers in her pocket. She had saved every penny from her work as a governess to buy passage on this wagon train. The other passengers looked at her with curious eyes. A young woman traveling alone was not common on the frontier. The wagon train had started from Independence, Missouri, 2 weeks before. There were 12 wagons in total, filled with families hoping to start new lives in the West. Some wagons carried supplies for the mining towns. Others held farming tools and seeds. Margaret's wagon was loaded with barrels of flour, salt, and other goods for the general store in Cedar Ridge. She shared the wagon with 3 other passengers. There was Mrs. Helen Carter, a widow going to live with her son in Denver. Mrs. Carter had kind eyes but talked too much about her dead husband. Next to her sat Samuel Brooks, a young man with big dreams of finding gold in the mountains. He spent most of his time reading maps and talking about getting rich. The third passenger was Dr. William Hayes, an older man with gray hair who was going to set up a medical practice in a small town. Margaret liked Dr. Hayes best. He was quiet and thoughtful, and he had brought many books with him. Sometimes he would lend her one to read during the long, boring hours on the trail. Mrs. Carter meant well, but she asked too many questions about why Margaret was traveling alone. Samuel was nice enough, but he only wanted to talk about gold and money. The wagon driver was a tough man named Pete Murphy. He had driven wagons across the plains for 15 years and knew every rock and river between Missouri and Colorado. Pete did not talk much, but when he did speak, people listened. He had warned them all about the dangers ahead. There could be storms, broken wheels, sick animals, or worse. Margaret tried not to think about the dangers. Instead, she thought about her new life as a teacher in Cedar Ridge. She had heard it was a growing town with families who needed someone to teach their children. She had been teaching rich children in Boston for 3 years, but this would be different. These would be frontier children who had never seen a real school. She touched the papers in her pocket again. They proved she was a real teacher, trained at the Boston Female Seminary. Without these papers, no one would hire her. They were the most important thing she owned. The wagon hit a deep rut in the trail, and everyone bounced hard on their seats. Mrs. Carter grabbed Margaret's arm to steady herself. "Oh my," she said. "These roads are terrible. I do not know how much more of this I can take." Dr. Hayes smiled at them both. "We are almost halfway there, ladies. Try to think of the adventure we are having." "Adventure?" Mrs. Carter repeated with a sniff. "I call it misery." Margaret looked out at the wide open spaces around them. The grass moved like waves in the wind. In the distance, she could see mountains rising up against the blue sky. It was beautiful and frightening at the same time. She had never seen so much empty land. Back in Boston, she had lived in a world of brick houses and narrow streets. There were always people around, always noise from the carriages and vendors. Here the only sounds were the creaking of the wagon wheels, the horses breathing hard, and the wind in the grass. At night, the wagon train would stop and form a circle. The men would take care of the animals while the women cooked dinner over small fires. Margaret had learned to help with the cooking, even though she had never done such work before. In Boston, servants had done all the cooking and cleaning. She had also learned to sleep on the hard ground with only a thin blanket. Her back ached every morning, but she did not complain. Complaining would not change anything, and she did not want people to think she was weak. The other women in the wagon train had been kind to her, but she could tell they wondered about her story. Why would a young lady from Boston travel alone to Colorado? What was she running from? Margaret had told them she was going to be a teacher, but she had not told them about Edmund Harwick or her father's anger when she refused to marry him. She remembered that terrible night 3 weeks ago. Her father had shouted at her for an hour, calling her ungrateful and foolish. "Edmund Harwick is a good match," he had said. "He has money and position. What more could you want?" But Margaret knew what Edmund was really like. She had seen how cruel he could be to people who worked for him. She had watched him smile at her father while looking at her like she was something he wanted to own. The thought of marrying him made her feel sick, so she had made her plan in secret. She had sold her jewelry and some of her dresses to get money for the trip. She had written to the school board in Cedar Ridge and received a letter saying they would be happy to have a qualified teacher. Then one morning, while her father was at his office, she had packed her bags and left. She wondered if her father was looking for her. She wondered if Edmund was angry, but mostly she tried not to think about Boston at all. That life was behind her now. The sun was getting lower in the sky. Soon, Pete would start looking for a good place to stop for the night. Margaret was hungry and tired, but she was also excited. Every mile brought her closer to her new life. Tomorrow they would cross a big river. Pete had said it might be dangerous if the water was high from recent rains, but Margaret was not afraid. She had already done the hardest thing she could imagine. She had left everything she knew to chase a dream of freedom. As the wagon rolled on toward the setting sun, Margaret O'Sullivan smiled for the first time in weeks. Whatever happened next, she would face it with courage. She was no longer the scared girl who had run away from Boston. She was becoming someone new, someone strong enough to make her own choices and live her own life. The morning of the third day started like any other. Margaret woke up stiff and sore from sleeping on the ground. She rolled up her blanket and helped Mrs. Carter pack their few belongings back into the wagon. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as the other families prepared breakfast over their small fires. Pete Murphy walked around checking the wheels and harnesses on all the wagons. His face looked worried as he studied the sky. Dark clouds were building up in the west, moving toward them like a gray wall. "We need to move fast today," Pete told the wagon train leader, a man named Captain Williams. "There is a big storm coming. I can smell it in the air." Margaret looked up at the sky. The clouds did look dangerous, piled high and dark. The air felt heavy and still. Even the horses seemed nervous, shaking their heads and stamping their feet. "How far to the next town?" Captain Williams asked. "Too far," Pete said. "We will have to ride through whatever comes." The wagon train started moving earlier than usual. Margaret could feel the tension in the air. The other passengers were quiet, watching the sky with worried faces. Even Samuel Brooks stopped talking about gold and kept looking at the dark clouds. By noon, the wind had started to pick up. It blew dust into their faces and made the canvas covers on the wagons flap and snap. The horses had to work harder to pull the heavy wagons against the wind. Mrs. Carter held onto her bonnet with both hands. "I do not like this weather," she said. "It reminds me of the terrible storm we had back home last spring." Dr. Hayes was reading a book, but Margaret noticed he was not turning the pages very often. He kept looking up at the sky, too. The first drops of rain started falling around 2 o'clock. They were big, heavy drops that made dark spots in the dust. Pete urged the horses to go faster. "We need to find shelter," he called back to his passengers, but there was no shelter to be found. They were crossing a wide valley with only grass and a few scattered trees. The mountains were still far ahead, and the last town was miles behind them. The rain came harder and faster. Soon it was pouring down in thick sheets. The wagon cover kept most of it off them, but water dripped through in several places. Margaret pulled her shawl over her head and tried to stay dry. Then the thunder started. The first clap was so loud it made everyone jump. The horses snorted and pulled against their harnesses. Pete had to use his whip to keep them moving forward. "Easy. Boys," he called to the horses. "Just a little noise." But the thunder got louder and came more often. Each crash made the horses more frightened. Margaret could see Pete struggling to control them. His knuckles were white as he gripped the reins. The lightning started next. Bright flashes lit up the dark afternoon sky. They came closer and closer together until the whole world seemed to flicker like a candle flame. "Oh, Lord," Mrs. Carter whispered. "We are going to die out here." Dr. Hayes put his book away and moved closer to the women. "Stay calm," he said. "Storms like this blow over quickly, but this storm was not blowing over. If anything, it was getting worse. The wind howled around the wagon, and the rain came down so hard they could barely see the wagon ahead of them. Then came the lightning, strike that changed everything. It hit a tall tree about 50 yards away from their wagon. The tree exploded in a shower of sparks and burning wood. The sound was like a cannon going off right next to their ears. That was when the horses lost their minds with fear. They reared up on their back legs, screaming in terror. Pete pulled hard, on the reins, but it was no use. The horses bolted forward, running as fast as they could to get away from the thunder and lightning. The wagon bounced and lurched as it picked up speed. Margaret grabbed the side of the wagon seat to keep from falling off. Mrs. Carter was screaming. Samuel was shouting for Pete to stop the horses. Dr. Hayes was trying to hold on to his medical bag. "Hold on," Pete yelled. "Hold on tight." But the horses would not listen to him anymore. They were running blind with panic, pulling the heavy wagon behind them. Margaret could feel the wagon wheels hitting rocks and holes in the ground. Each bump threw them higher into the air. They were moving away from the other wagons now, heading toward a line of hills. Margaret looked back and saw the rest of the wagon train getting smaller and smaller behind them. Captain Williams was riding his horse after them, but he could not catch up. The wagon hit a big rock and tilted up on two wheels. For a moment, Margaret thought they were going to tip over. Then it crashed back down with a sound like breaking bones. Mrs. Carter had stopped screaming and was now praying out loud. "Our Father who art in heaven," she said over and over. Pete was still fighting with the reins, but Margaret could see that he was losing the battle. The horses were completely wild now. They ran down the hill toward a rocky valley, jumping over fallen logs and dodging between boulders. "The brake!" Dr. Hayes shouted. "Use the brake!" Pete tried to reach the brake handle, but he needed both hands to hold the reins. If he let go, the horses would run them straight into a rock wall. Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. She let go of the wagon side and lunged forward toward the brake handle. The wagon was bouncing so hard she could barely keep her balance. "What are you doing?" Samuel yelled. Margaret did not answer. She grabbed the brake handle and pulled as hard as she could. The brake shoes pressed against the wheels with a loud grinding sound. It slowed the wagon a little, but not enough. They were heading straight for a line of big boulders. Pete saw them too and tried to turn the horses to the left. The wagon tilted again, this time even more. "Jump!" Dr. Hayes shouted. "We have to jump!" But there was no time to jump. The wagon hit the first boulder with a crash that threw everyone into the air. Margaret felt herself flying through the rain and wind. She saw the gray sky spinning above her and the dark ground rushing up to meet her. Time seemed to slow down. She thought about her father and Edmund Harwick and the teaching job she would never get to start. This was how her adventure would end, she thought. Not in a classroom full of children, but on the rocks of a Colorado hillside in the middle of a thunderstorm. She closed her eyes and waited to hit the ground. But something else happened instead. Strong arms reached out and caught her in midair. She felt herself being pulled against a warm chest. She heard a man's voice saying, "I got you. You're safe now." Margaret opened her eyes and found herself looking into the kindest face she had ever seen. It belonged to a man on horseback, a cowboy with dark hair and gentle brown eyes. He was holding her tight against him while his horse danced nervously under the weight of two riders. Behind them, she could hear the wagon crashing into more rocks. She could hear Pete Murphy cursing and the horses screaming. But she was safe in this stranger's arms, and for the moment, that was all that mattered. The cowboy looked down at her with concern in his eyes. "Are you hurt, miss?" Margaret tried to speak but found she had no voice. She shook her head. "Good," the cowboy said. "Let us get you out of this storm." Margaret felt safe in the cowboy's strong arms as his horse carried them away from the crashed wagon. The rain was still falling hard, but she was no longer afraid. This stranger had saved her life, and something about his calm voice made her feel protected. "We need to get you somewhere dry," the cowboy said. He had to speak loudly over the storm. "My ranch is not far from here." Margaret nodded, still unable to find her voice. She looked back toward the wreckage of the wagon. She could see Pete, Murphy sitting on the ground holding his arm. Dr. Hayes was kneeling beside Mrs. Carter, who was not moving. Samuel Brooks was standing up but looked hurt and confused. "My friends," Margaret finally managed to say, "we have to help them." "Don't worry," the cowboy said. "I saw riders coming from your wagon train. They will take care of your people. Right now, I need to get you warm and dry before you catch your death." Margaret wanted to argue, but she was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. Her dress was soaked through and the cold wind cut right through her. She realized the cowboy was right. She would not be much help to anyone if she got sick. The cowboy's horse was a big bay stallion that moved carefully over the rocky ground. Margaret could feel the man's strong chest against her back and smell the leather of his jacket. She had never been this close to a man who was not her father or Edmund Harwick. It should have frightened her, but somehow it did not. "What is your name, miss?" the cowboy asked as they rode. "Margaret O'Sullivan," she said. "I am Jake Morrison. I own the Circle M Ranch about 2 miles from here." Margaret tried to place his accent. It was not like the rough speech of Pete Murphy or the other wagon drivers. Jake Morrison spoke like an educated man, though his clothes were those of a working cowboy. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said. "Just Jake," he said. "And you don't need to thank me. Any man would have done the same." Margaret doubted that was true. She had seen how fast everything happened when she was thrown from the wagon. Jake Morrison must have very quick reflexes and a good heart to risk his own safety for a stranger. They rode through a narrow valley between 2 hills. The storm was starting to pass, and the rain became lighter. Margaret could see buildings ahead through the gray afternoon light. Jake's ranch was bigger than she had expected. There was a large house with a wide porch, a big barn, and several smaller buildings. "Rosa," Jake called as they approached the house. "Rosa, I need your help." An older Mexican woman came out onto the porch. She took one look at Margaret and immediately understood the situation. "Bring her inside," Rosa said. "Quickly now. The poor girl is half frozen." Jake helped Margaret down from his horse and carried her up the porch steps. Her legs felt weak and shaky. She was not sure she could have walked on her own. The inside of Jake's house was warm and comfortable. There were books on shelves, a big stone fireplace, and furniture that looked well made but not fancy. It felt like a real home, not like the cold, formal rooms of her father's house in Boston. Rosa took charge immediately. "You men get out of here," she told Jake. "This girl needs to get out of those wet clothes before she catches pneumonia." Jake nodded and headed for the door. "I will go check on your friends at the wagon," he told Margaret. "Rosa will take good care of you." After Jake left, Rosa led Margaret to a bedroom and helped her out of her soaked dress. "You are lucky that man was nearby," Rosa said as she wrapped Margaret in warm blankets. "Jake Morrison has saved more than one person from trouble over the years." "How long have you worked for him?" Margaret asked. "Worked for him?" Rosa laughed. "Child, I have known Jake since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His mother was my best friend. When she died, I promised to look after her boy. That was 25 years ago." Rosa brought Margaret hot soup and coffee. As Margaret ate, she learned more about her rescuer. Jake Morrison was 28 years old and had owned the ranch for 6 years. He raised cattle and horses. His parents had both died when he was young, and Rosa had helped raise him. "Is he married?" Margaret asked, then felt her face turn red. She did not know why she had asked such a personal question. Rosa's face grew sad. "He was married to a sweet girl named Sarah, but she died 2 years ago when their baby was born. The baby died too. Jake has been alone ever since, except for me and the ranch hands." Margaret felt a wave of sympathy for Jake Morrison. No wonder his eyes looked sad even when he smiled. "He went to college back east," Rosa continued. "Studied law for a while. But after Sarah died, he said he didn't want anything to do with town life anymore. He just wanted to work with his hands and be left alone." Margaret thought about this as she finished her soup. Jake Morrison was clearly more than just a simple cowboy. He was educated and thoughtful, but he had chosen a life away from civilization. She wondered what had really driven him to leave his law studies. About an hour later, Jake returned with news about the others from the wagon. Pete Murphy has a broken arm, but he will be fine, he reported. Mrs. Carter has a bump on her head and some bruises. Dr. Hayes is taking care of everyone. Your friend Samuel just has some cuts and scrapes. Where are they now? Margaret asked. Captain Williams got them all to a cave about a mile from here where they can stay dry. The wagon is completely destroyed, but they saved most of the supplies. They will have to wait for another wagon to come from the next town. Margaret felt relieved that her traveling companions were safe, but worried about her own situation. What about me? How will I get to Cedar Ridge? Jake was quiet for a moment. That might take a while, he said. The bridge over Miller Creek was washed out in the storm. No wagons can get through for at least a week, maybe longer. Margaret's heart sank. She had been so close to starting her new life, and now she was stuck. She had very little money left, and she could not afford to stay in a hotel even if there was one nearby. You can stay here, Jake said quickly, as if he could read her thoughts. Rosa has plenty of room, and we could use the company. I could not impose on your kindness, Margaret said. It would not be an imposition, Jake replied. Besides, Rosa gets lonely with just me and the ranch hands around. She would enjoy having another woman to talk to. Rosa nodded enthusiastically. The man speaks the truth. I have been telling him for months that this house needs more life in it. Margaret looked around the comfortable room and thought about her limited options. She could stay here with these kind people, or she could try to make her way to town with no money and no transportation. If you are sure I would not be a burden, she said finally. No burden at all, Jake said with a smile that made his whole face light up. Welcome to the Circle M Ranch, Miss O'Sullivan. As Margaret settled into the guest room that night, she thought about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she had been just another passenger on a wagon train. Tonight she was staying in the home of a mysterious cowboy who had literally caught her when she fell. She looked out the window at the stars beginning to appear as the storm clouds moved away. Maybe this delay was not such a bad thing after all. She had a feeling there was much more to learn about Jake Morrison and his ranch. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, and for the first time since leaving Boston, Margaret was excited to see what would happen next. Margaret woke up the next morning in a soft, clean bed. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered the storm, the runaway wagon, and Jake Morrison catching her in his arms. She sat up and looked around the guest room. Sunlight was streaming through white curtains and she could hear birds singing outside. Someone had cleaned and mended her dress while she slept. It was hanging on a chair next to the bed, looking almost as good as new. On the table beside her bed was a bowl of fresh water and a clean towel. Margaret got dressed and went to find Rosa. She followed the smell of bacon and coffee to the kitchen. Rosa was standing at the stove humming a Spanish song while she cooked breakfast. Good morning, dear, Rosa said with a warm smile. Did you sleep well? Very well, thank you, Margaret said. I have not slept that peacefully in weeks. Jake said to let you rest as long as you needed. He has already been up for hours working with the cattle. That man never stops moving. Margaret looked out the kitchen window and saw Jake in the distance, riding his horse among a herd of cattle. Even from far away, she could tell he was completely at ease on horseback. He moved with the natural grace of someone who had spent his whole life working outdoors. How many cattle does he have? Margaret asked. About 500 head, Rosa said. Plus some horses. It is a good ranch, but it keeps him very busy, especially since he tries to do too much by himself. Does he not have help? He has 4 ranch hands, but Jake still works harder than any of them. I think he uses the work to keep his mind off his troubles. After breakfast, Rosa showed Margaret around the house. It was larger than it looked from outside, with 4 bedrooms, a parlor, a dining room, and Jake's study. The study impressed Margaret the most. It was full of books on every subject she could imagine. Law books, history books, novels, and books about ranching and farming. Jake reads every night, Rosa explained. Sometimes I think he misses his old life more than he admits. Margaret picked up a book of poetry and opened it. On the first page, someone had written, "To Jake with love, Sarah." Margaret quickly closed the book and put it back on the shelf. I'm sorry, she said. I did not mean to pry. It is all right, Rosa said gently. Sarah loved books too. I think that is one reason Jake liked her so much. She was the only person in town who could talk to him about ideas and learning. Margaret understood that feeling. In Boston, most people thought women should not care about books and ideas. Edmund Harwick had often told her that too much reading was not good for a lady's mind. Around noon, Jake came back to the house for lunch. His clothes were dusty and his hands were dirty from work, but Margaret thought he looked more handsome than he had the night before. There was something attractive about a man who was not afraid of hard work. "How are you feeling today, Miss O'Sullivan?" Jake asked as he washed his hands at the kitchen pump. "Much better, thank you, and please call me Margaret." "Margaret it is then, and you must call me Jake." During lunch, Jake told her more about the area. Cedar Ridge was about 20 miles away, a growing town with a silver mine and several ranches nearby. The schoolhouse there had been empty for almost a year because the last teacher had gotten married and moved away. "The children have been going without proper schooling," Jake said. "Their parents try to teach them, but most of the adults can barely read themselves." Margaret felt excited at the thought of teaching those children. It would be so different from working with the rich children in Boston, who already had every advantage in life. "I heard there might be another schoolhouse closer than Cedar Ridge," Jake said carefully. "Where?" Margaret asked. "Right here in Miller Valley. There is an old building in town that used to be a school, but it has been closed for 5 years. The town council has been talking about opening it again if they could find a teacher." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "How far is the town from here?" "About 3 miles. Close enough that you could ride there and back every day if you had a horse." After lunch, Jake offered to show Margaret around the ranch. They walked to the barn first, where Margaret met Jake's favorite horse, a beautiful black mare named Star. "She is the smartest horse I have ever owned," Jake said as he patted the mare's neck. "She can find her way home in the dark and seems to know what I am thinking before I do." Margaret had never been around horses much, but Star seemed gentle and friendly. The mare let Margaret pet her soft nose and did not shy away when Margaret spoke to her. "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch?" Jake asked. They walked through the pastures where the cattle were grazing. Jake explained how he rotated the herds to different fields so the grass would not get eaten down too much. He showed her the stream that provided water for the animals and the vegetable garden that Rosa tended. Margaret was impressed by how well organized everything was. Jake clearly understood both the business side of ranching and the hard work that went with it. This was not a man who just inherited his property and let others do the work. "You really know what you are doing," Margaret said. Jake looked pleased by her comment. "I learned from my father and from books. Ranching is changing these days. The old ways do not always work anymore." "Is that why you studied law? To help with the business side?" Jake's face grew serious. "Partly, but I also thought I could help people. There are a lot of small ranchers and farmers out here who get cheated by the big companies. I wanted to fight for them." "What changed your mind?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah's death changed everything. I realized that all the book learning in the world did not matter if you could not protect the people you loved. So I came back here where things make sense to me." Margaret could hear the pain in his voice. She wanted to say something comforting, but she did not know what words would help. They walked back toward the house as the sun started to get lower in the sky. Margaret realized she had enjoyed this day more than any day since leaving Boston. There was something peaceful about ranch life that appealed to her. "Jake," she said as they reached the porch, "could you really help me look into that teaching job in Miller Valley?" His face lit up with a smile. "I would be happy to. In fact, I know most of the people on the town council. I could arrange for you to meet them." "That would be wonderful. There is just one thing," Jake said, looking a little embarrassed. "The schoolhouse needs a lot of work before it could be used. The roof leaks, some of the windows are broken, and it has not been cleaned in years." "I am not afraid of hard work," Margaret said. "I know that. I could see it yesterday during the storm. Not many people would have tried to help with that runaway wagon the way you did." That evening, they sat on the porch after dinner and watched the sunset paint the mountains red and gold. Rosa had gone to visit a friend in town, so Margaret and Jake were alone for the first time. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. Of course. What really made you leave Boston? It must have been something important to make you travel so far by yourself. Margaret had been expecting this question. She decided to tell him the truth. My father wanted me to marry a man I could not stand, she said. A banker named Edmund Harwick. He is rich and respectable, but he is also cruel and controlling. I knew if I married him I would never have a life of my own. Jake nodded slowly. That took courage. Or foolishness. I am not sure which. Courage, Jake said firmly. Any woman who would try to stop a runaway wagon has plenty of courage. Margaret felt her face grow warm at his words. She looked out at the peaceful valley and thought about how different her life had become in just 2 days. I think I am going to like it here, she said. I hope so, Jake replied quietly. This place could use someone like you. 2 weeks passed like a pleasant dream for Margaret. Each morning she woke up to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of Rosa's coffee. Each day brought new experiences and small adventures that made her forget about her old life in Boston. Jake had been true to his word about the teaching job. 3 days after the storm, he took Margaret to town to meet the Miller Valley School Board. The town was smaller than she had expected, with just one main street lined with wooden buildings. There was a general store, a saloon, a church, and about 20 houses. The old schoolhouse sat at the end of the street, looking sad and forgotten. The paint was peeling, weeds grew around the steps, and several windows were cracked or missing completely. But Margaret could see the possibilities. The building was solid and it had a good location where children could walk from anywhere in town. The school board consisted of 3 men, Mr. Patterson, who owned the general store, Mr. Lewis the blacksmith, and Dr. Miller, who had started the town 20 years earlier. They were all pleased to meet Margaret and impressed by her teaching credentials from Boston. We have been wanting to open the school again for 2 years, Mr. Patterson explained. But we could not find anyone qualified to teach. Most educated people do not want to live in a small town like ours. I think I would like small town life. Very much, Margaret said. The men offered her the job on the spot. The pay was not much, but it would be enough for her to live on. They also promised to help fix up the schoolhouse so it would be ready for students. When could you start? Dr. Miller asked. Margaret looked at Jake, who was standing quietly beside her. I could start as soon as the schoolhouse is ready, she said. Excellent, Mr. Lewis said. We will begin repairs tomorrow. As they walked back to Jake's wagon, Margaret felt excited and nervous at the same time. She was really going to be a frontier teacher. It was everything she had dreamed of when she left Boston. Are you happy with the job? Jake asked as they drove home. Very happy, but also a little scared. What if the children do not like me? What if I am not a good enough teacher for them? Jake smiled. You will be fine. I can tell you care about teaching, and that is the most important thing. The next morning, Jake surprised Margaret by announcing that he was going to help with the school repairs. I know something about fixing buildings, he said, and I want to make sure everything is done right. Margaret was touched by his kindness, but she also worried that he was taking too much time away from his ranch work. You do not need to do this for me, she said. I am not just doing it for you, Jake replied. This whole valley will benefit from having a good school. It is important. Work. For the next 10 days, Jake spent his mornings working on the ranch and his afternoons at the schoolhouse. Margaret helped as much as she could, cleaning windows, scrubbing floors, and painting walls. She had never done such physical work before, but she found she enjoyed it. Working side by side with Jake gave Margaret a chance to see a different side of him. He was patient and careful with his work, and he treated the other men helping with the repairs as equals rather than hired hands. She noticed that people in town clearly respected him. They came to him for advice about everything from sick cattle to family problems. Jake Morrison is the best man in this whole valley, Mr. Patterson told Margaret one afternoon. If he says something, you can count on it being true. Margaret was also learning about Jake's past from the things he did not say. Sometimes when they were working together, he would start to tell her about something, then stop himself and change the subject. She could tell there were parts of his story that still hurt too much to share. One evening, they were painting the last classroom wall when Jake finally opened up a little more. "Sarah and I used to talk about having children who would go to this school," he said quietly. "She always said she wanted our kids to have the best education possible." Margaret stopped painting and looked at him. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman." She was, smart and kind and full of dreams. "She would have liked you, I think. I wish I could have met her." Jake was quiet for a moment. "She died because there was no good doctor in town when the baby came. Dr. Miller was visiting his sister in Denver, and the midwife did not know what to do when things went wrong." Margaret felt her heart break for him. "I am so sorry, Jake. That is when I decided to quit law school and come back here. I thought if I had been here instead of in the city studying books, maybe I could have helped somehow." "You could not have known," Margaret said gently. "Maybe not, but I learned that all the education in the world does not matter if you are not there when people need you." Margaret understood now why Jake had chosen to stay on his ranch instead of pursuing his law career. He blamed himself for not being there when his wife died, even though it was not his fault. "You help people every day," Margaret said. "Look what you did for me. And look how hard you are working to get this school ready." Jake managed a small smile. "I suppose you're right." As the days passed, Margaret found herself looking forward to her time with Jake more and more. She loved listening to him talk about books they had both read, or hearing his ideas about how to improve life in the valley. He was the most intelligent man she had ever met, but he wore his learning lightly. She also discovered that Jake had a wonderful sense of humor. He could make her laugh with stories about his ranch animals or funny things that happened in town. Margaret had forgotten how good it felt to laugh freely with someone who understood her. One afternoon, they were taking a break from painting when Jake asked her about her life in Boston. "Do you miss it at all?" he said. Margaret thought carefully before answering. "I miss some things. I miss the libraries and the museums. I miss being able to buy any book I wanted. But I do not miss the life I was expected to live there." "What do you mean?" "Ladies in Boston are not supposed to have their own thoughts or dreams. We are supposed to look pretty, marry well, and let our husbands make all the decisions. I never fit into that world very well." Jake nodded. "I can see that. You are not the kind of woman who would be happy just sitting in a parlor doing needlework." "Exactly. Here, I feel like I can be myself. I can work with my hands, speak my mind, and make my own choices, even if those choices include living in a place with no libraries or museums." Margaret looked around at the mountains visible through the schoolhouse window. "I think I can live without those things if I have work that matters and people who care about the same things I do." When she said this, Jake gave her a look that made her heart race. There was something in his eyes that made her think he might be starting to care about her, as more than just a friend. The schoolhouse was finally finished on a sunny Saturday morning. Margaret stood in the main classroom and looked around with pride. The walls were freshly painted, the windows sparkled, and new desks had been built by Mr. Lewis. It looked like a real school now. "Ready for your first day of teaching?" Jake asked. "More than ready," Margaret said. "The children start on Monday, and I have spent all week preparing lessons. I am sure you will be wonderful." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who had done so much to help her dreams come true. "I could not have done any of this without you, Jake." "Yes, you could have. You are stronger than you think, Margaret O'Sullivan." As they locked up the schoolhouse and walked to Jake's wagon, Margaret realized that somewhere over the past 2 weeks, her feelings for Jake Morrison had grown into something much deeper than gratitude. She was falling in love with him, and she thought he might be falling in love with her too. The question was, what would they do about it? Margaret had been teaching for 3 weeks when her past caught up with her. It was a Tuesday morning, and she was helping 8-year-old Tommy Patterson with his reading when she heard horses outside the schoolhouse. Through the window, she saw 4 men in fancy city clothes riding expensive horses. Her blood turned cold when she recognized the man in front. Edmund Harwick had found her. "Children," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm, "please work quietly on your writing exercises. I will be right back." She stepped outside and closed the schoolhouse door behind her. Edmund was already climbing down from his horse. He looked exactly the same as he had in Boston, with his perfectly groomed mustache and cold blue eyes. The 3 men with him looked like the kind of people he hired to do his dirty work. "Hello, Margaret," Edmund said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You have led me on quite a chase." "How did you find me?" Margaret asked. "It was not easy. But money can buy a lot of information. I traced you from the wagon train records, then followed the story of the storm and the crash. Several people in Cedar Ridge remembered hearing about a Boston schoolteacher who ended up in Miller Valley." Margaret lifted her chin and tried to look braver than she felt. "What do you want, Edmund?" "I want my fiancée to come home where she belongs. I am not your fiancée. I never agreed to marry you." Edmund's smile became more like a snarl. "Your father signed a contract, my dear. You belong to me legally until that contract is fulfilled or broken according to its terms." "What terms?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "You must either marry me or pay a penalty of $5,000 for breach of promise. Since I know you do not have that kind of money, you really have no choice." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. $5,000 was more money than she could earn in 10 years of teaching. Her father had trapped her just as surely, as if he had put her in a cage. "I will not go with you," she said. "Oh, but you will." Edmund gestured to his men. "I have legal papers that say you are my property until this matter is settled. If you do not come willingly, these gentlemen will help you see reason." At that moment, Jake Morrison came riding up fast on his black mare. He had seen the strange horses from his pasture and had come to investigate. Margaret had never been so happy to see anyone in her life. Jake took in the situation quickly. 4 armed men threatening a woman. He did not need to know the details to understand what was happening. "Is there a problem here?" Jake asked. His voice was calm, but Margaret could see his hand resting near the gun on his hip. "No problem at all," Edmund said smoothly. "I'm just collecting my runaway fiancée." "Margaret," Jake said, not taking his eyes off Edmund, "do you want to go with these men?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "I do not." "Then I suggest you gentlemen—" "Ride on," Jake said. Edmund laughed. "And who are you to tell me what to do? Some cowboy who thinks he can play hero?" "I am someone who does not like to see women threatened," Jake replied. "This woman belongs to me by law," Edmund said. He pulled out a folded paper from his coat. "I have a legal contract signed by her father. She is promised to me in marriage, and if she does not honor that promise, she owes me $5,000 in damages." Jake read the paper quickly. Margaret could see his jaw tighten as he understood what it meant. "This contract was signed without Miss O'Sullivan's consent," Jake said. "It is not worth the paper it is written on." "Perhaps that is true in this backwater territory," Edmund said. "But in Massachusetts, where the contract was signed, a father has the right to arrange his daughter's marriage, and I intend to enforce my rights." "Not here you will not," Jake said. Edmund's pleasant mask finally slipped away completely. "Listen, cowboy. I have spent 3 months and a lot of money tracking this woman down. I am not leaving without her. You can either step aside or my men can move you aside." The 3 hired men shifted in their saddles and moved their hands closer to their weapons. Margaret realized this could turn into a gunfight, and she could not bear the thought of Jake getting hurt because of her problems. "Wait," she said. "Maybe we can work something out." "Margaret, no," Jake said sharply. "I do not have $5,000, Margaret said to Edmund. "But I am working now. I could pay you a little each month until the debt is settled." Edmund shook his head. "I did not come all this way for monthly payments. I came for a wife. You are going to marry me, Margaret, just as your father promised." "Over my dead body," Jake said quietly. "That can be arranged," one of Edmund's men said. The tension in the air was so thick Margaret could hardly breathe. She looked around and saw that some of the townspeople had noticed the commotion. Mr. Patterson was standing outside his store, and Dr. Miller was walking quickly toward them. But they were still outnumbered and outgunned. "There is one other option," Jake said suddenly. "What?" Edmund asked. "Miss O'Sullivan could marry someone else. That would void your contract completely." Edmund's face turned red with anger. "She cannot marry anyone else. She belongs to me. Actually, Jake said, under territorial law, any woman over 21 can marry whoever she chooses, regardless of any previous agreements made by her family. Margaret stared at Jake in amazement. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? You cannot be serious, Edmund sputtered. Dead serious, Jake said. He turned to Margaret. Miss O'Sullivan, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. Jake was proposing to her to save her from Edmund, but was it just to help her, or did he really want to marry her? Margaret began. Think carefully, my dear, Edmund interrupted. If you marry this cowboy, you will be stuck in this wilderness, forever. Come with me and you will have everything money can buy. Margaret looked at Edmund's cold, cruel face, then at Jake's kind, honest eyes. She thought about the past month of working beside Jake, laughing with him and falling in love with him a little more each day. Yes, she said clearly. Yes, I will marry you, Jake Morrison. Edmund's face went purple with rage. This is not over, he snarled. I will not be cheated out of what is mine. You were not cheated out of anything, Jake said. You never owned Margaret in the first place. By now, half the town had gathered around the schoolhouse. Dr. Miller stepped forward with his medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Is there a problem here, Jake? Dr. Miller asked. These gentlemen were just leaving, Jake said. Edmund looked around at the growing crowd of townspeople, all of whom were clearly on Jake and Margaret's side. He was outnumbered and far from home. Even if he was legally in the right, which was questionable, he could not enforce his claim against an entire town. This is not finished, Edmund said to Margaret. I will find a way to make you pay for this humiliation. Get off my land, Jake said coldly, and do not come back. Edmund and his men rode away, but not before Edmund turned back to shout one last threat. Enjoy your little frontier wedding, Margaret, but remember that contracts can be enforced in many ways. I will get what I am owed, one way or another. As the dust from their horses settled, Margaret realized what had just happened. She had agreed to marry Jake Morrison, a man she had known for less than a month. She was either the luckiest woman in the world or the biggest fool. Are you all right? Jake asked softly. Margaret nodded, though she was shaking. Thank you for saving me again. We should probably talk about what just happened, Jake said. Yes, Margaret agreed. We should definitely talk. The townspeople were still watching them with curious faces. Margaret realized that news of their engagement would be all over Miller Valley by supper time. Should we go back to the ranch? Jake asked. Margaret looked at the schoolhouse where her students were still waiting. I need to finish the school day first. Could we talk tonight? Of course. Take all the time you need. As Jake rode away and Margaret went back to her classroom, she wondered what she had gotten herself into. She cared for Jake deeply, but was she ready to marry him? And more importantly, did he really want to marry her? Or was he just being kind to a woman in trouble? Only time would tell. Margaret could barely concentrate on teaching for the rest of the day. Her mind kept going back to Jake's proposal and Edmund's angry threats. When she finally dismissed the children at 3 o'clock, she was relieved to see several townspeople waiting outside the schoolhouse. Mrs. Lewis, the blacksmith's wife, was the first to approach her. My dear, are you all right? That man looked very dangerous. I am fine, thank you, Margaret said, though her hands were still shaking a little. We heard what happened, said Mr. Patterson. Jake Morrison asking you to marry him right in front of everyone. That was quite something. Dr. Miller stepped forward with a serious expression. Miss O'Sullivan, I need to ask you something important. Did you really want to accept Jake's proposal, or did you just feel forced into it? Margaret was touched by his concern. I accepted because I wanted to, Dr. Miller. Jake is a good man. That he is? Dr. Miller agreed. But marriage is serious business. You should not feel rushed into anything just because of that banker fellow. We are going to talk about it tonight, Margaret said. Jake and I both want to make sure we are doing this for the right reasons. Mrs. Lewis smiled warmly. Jake Morrison has been alone too long. It would be good for him to have a wife again, and good for this town to have a permanent teacher, added Mr. Patterson. We were worried you might leave if that city man convinced you to go back east. Margaret walked home to the ranch feeling overwhelmed by all the support from the townspeople. She had never lived in a place where neighbors cared so much about each other. In Boston, people minded their own business and rarely got involved in other people's problems. When she arrived at the ranch, Rosa was waiting on the porch with a worried look on her face. Jake told me what happened, Rosa said. Are you hurt? Did those men frighten you? I am all right, Margaret said, just confused about everything. Come inside. I made your favorite soup and we can talk while we wait for Jake to finish with the cattle. Over dinner, Margaret told Rosa the whole story about Edmund Harwick and the marriage contract her father had signed. Rosa listened carefully, shaking her head in disgust. Men who treat women like property make me sick, Rosa said. Your father had no right to promise you to anyone without asking what you wanted. But what if Edmund was right about the law? What if the contract really is legal? Legal or not, you are in Colorado territory now. Things are different here. Women have more rights and the men respect that. Do you think Jake really wants to marry me or was he just trying to help me out of trouble? Rosa smiled knowingly. Child, I have been watching that man for weeks. He looks at you the way he used to look at Sarah. Not exactly the same because you are not the same person, but with the same kind of caring. But we have only known each other for a month. Sometimes a month is enough. Sometimes you know right away when someone is right for you. Other times you can know someone for years and never really understand them. Margaret thought about Edmund Harwick. She had known him for 2 years and she had never felt anything but dislike for him. But with Jake, she had felt a connection almost from the first day. What if I am making a mistake? Margaret asked. What if you are missing a chance for happiness? Rosa replied. Life is too short to let fear make all your decisions. Jake came home just as the sun was setting. He looked tired and dusty from his work, but his face lit up when he saw Margaret sitting on the porch. How was the rest of your school day? He asked as he sat down beside her. Difficult to focus on. The children kept asking questions about the men with guns. I am sorry you had to deal with that. I should have realized Harwick might try to track you down. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Jake spoke. Margaret, we need to talk about what happened today. About what I said. I know. I do not want you to feel like you have to marry me just to escape from Harwick. If you want, I can help you find another way to handle the situation. Margaret turned to look at him. What other way? I could loan you the money to pay off the contract. You could pay me back over time with no interest. $5,000 is a lot of money, Jake. I could never pay you back. You could if you wanted to. But that is not the point. The point is that you should have choices. Margaret felt her heart swell with affection for this man who was willing to give up so much to help her. Why would you do that for me? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Because I care about you. More than I thought I would ever care about anyone again. Care about me how? I think you know how. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. I think I do. But I would like to hear you say it. Jake took her hand in his. I love you, Margaret. I did not expect it to happen, and I tried to fight it because it felt like I was being disloyal to Sarah's memory. But I cannot deny it anymore. And I love you too, Margaret said softly. I have for weeks now. So the question is, do we get married because we love each other, or do we wait and court properly like normal people? Margaret thought about this carefully. What do you want to do? I want to marry you as soon as possible, Jake said. Not because of Harwick, but because I do not want to waste any more time. I lost 2 years after Sarah died, and I do not want to lose any more time when I could be building a life with you. Then let us get married, Margaret said. But I want everyone to know it is because we choose each other, not because we were forced into it. Jake smiled and squeezed her hand. How do we do that? We wait 1 week. During that time, we let people see that we are happy about this decision. We act like a real engaged couple, not like two people who got trapped into something. That sounds like a good plan, but what if Harwick comes back during that week? Then we face him together, as partners. Jake leaned over and kissed her gently. It was Margaret's first real kiss, and it made her feel warm all over. "I promise you will never regret this," Jake said. "I know I will not." The next morning, Jake and Margaret drove to town together to announce their engagement officially. Dr. Miller agreed to perform the ceremony the following Saturday. Mrs. Lewis and several other women offered to help plan a small celebration after the wedding. Word spread quickly through the valley that Jake Morrison and the schoolteacher were getting married. Some people were surprised by how fast it was happening, but most folks seemed pleased. Jake was well-liked, and Margaret had already proven herself as a good teacher and a hard worker. On Thursday, 3 days before the wedding, Edmund Harwick returned. But this time he was not alone. He brought a sheriff's deputy from the county seat and 2 more hired men. "I have a legal warrant for the arrest of Margaret O'Sullivan," Edmund announced when he found Jake and Margaret at the schoolhouse. "She is wanted for theft in Massachusetts." "Theft of what?" Jake demanded. "She stole jewelry and money from her father's house when she ran away. The value is over $1,000, which makes it a felony." Margaret felt sick. She had sold her own jewelry to pay for her trip, but she had also taken some money from her father's desk. She had told herself it was payment for all the years. She had worked as his unpaid hostess, but legally it was probably theft. "I am going to have to take her back to Boston for trial," the deputy said apologetically. "I am sorry, but I have no choice." "Wait," Jake said. "How much money are we talking about exactly?" $200 in cash, plus the jewelry she stole, Edmund said with satisfaction. "I did not steal the jewelry," Margaret said. "It was mine." "Prove it," Edmund sneered. Jake stepped forward. "I will pay whatever she supposedly owes right now." "It is not that simple," the deputy said. "There are legal procedures that have to be followed." But Jake was already reaching for his wallet. He counted out $300 and handed it to the deputy. "This should cover everything, plus extra for your trouble." The deputy looked confused. "I am not sure I can just take money instead of making an arrest." "Sure you can," Dr. Miller said as he walked up to join them. "If the debt is paid, there is no crime. I am a lawyer as well as a doctor, and I can assure you that restitution cancels the theft charge." Edmund looked furious, but he could not argue with the law. The deputy took the money and tore up the warrant. "This still does not settle our business," Edmund told Margaret. "You still owe me for breach of promise." "Actually," Dr. Miller said with a smile, "when Miss O'Sullivan marries Mr. Morrison on Saturday, that contract becomes void. Marriage to another man is a complete defense against breach of promise claims." Edmund's face turned purple with rage. He had been outwitted at every turn, and there was nothing more he could do legally. "You have not heard the last of me," he snarled as he rode away with his men. But Margaret was no longer afraid of Edmund Harwick. She had Jake beside her and an entire community supporting her. Whatever Edmund tried next, she knew she could handle it. Saturday could not come soon enough. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, with not a cloud in the sky. Margaret woke up in her room at the ranch for the last time as a single woman. Tonight she would be Mrs. Jake Morrison, sleeping in the room that had belonged to Sarah. The thought made her both happy and nervous. Rosa had been bustling around the house since before sunrise, cooking and cleaning for the small reception they would have after the ceremony. The whole house smelled like fresh bread, apple pie, and Rosa's famous enchiladas. "Today is the day," Rosa said with a big smile as she brought Margaret coffee and breakfast in bed. "How are you feeling?" "Excited, scared, happy, all mixed up together," Margaret said. "That is normal for a bride. I felt the same way when I married my husband 40 years ago." Margaret had borrowed a dress from Mrs. Lewis for the wedding. It was made of soft blue fabric with tiny white flowers, and it fit her perfectly. Rosa had found some white ribbons to weave through Margaret's hair, and she had a small bouquet of wildflowers that Jake had picked for her. "You look beautiful," Rosa said as she helped Margaret get dressed. "Jake is a lucky man." "I think I am the lucky one," Margaret replied. At 10 o'clock, Jake came to the house dressed in his best suit. Margaret had never seen him in anything but work clothes, and she was amazed at how handsome he looked. His dark hair was neatly combed and he had shaved carefully. He looked nervous but happy. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm. "Ready," Margaret said. They rode to town in Jake's wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by some of the ranch hands. People came out of their houses to wave at them as they passed. Margaret felt like a princess in a fairy tale. The church was small but packed with people. It seemed like everyone in Miller Valley had come to see the wedding. Margaret was surprised to see some faces she did not recognize. "Who are all these people?" she whispered to Jake as they walked down the aisle. "Ranchers, and their families from all over the valley," Jake whispered back. "Word has spread about our story. People want to show their support." Dr. Miller was waiting at the front of the church, wearing his best black suit and holding a prayer book. He smiled warmly at Margaret and Jake as they approached. "Friends," Dr. Miller said to the crowded church, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Jake Morrison and Margaret O'Sullivan. This is a special day for our community. We are not just gaining a new family, but we are also celebrating the power of love to overcome difficult circumstances." Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she listened to Dr. Miller speak about love and commitment. She looked at Jake and saw that his eyes were shining too. "Jake Morrison," Dr. Miller said, "do you take Margaret O'Sullivan to be your wife, to love and cherish her, in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake said firmly, looking straight into Margaret's eyes. "Margaret O'Sullivan, do you take Jake Morrison to be your husband, to love and honor him, in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Margaret said, surprised by how strong her own voice sounded. Jake had bought a simple gold ring from Mr. Patterson's store. As he slipped it onto Margaret's finger, she felt like her heart might burst with happiness. "By the power given to me by Colorado Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Dr. Miller said. "Jake, you may kiss your bride." Jake's kiss was gentle and sweet, and the whole church erupted in cheers and applause. Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the love and support surrounding them. After the ceremony, everyone gathered at the church hall for the reception. Rosa had outdone herself with the food, and several other women had brought dishes to share. There was music and dancing, and Margaret had never felt so welcomed by a community. "Welcome to the family, dear," said Mrs. Patterson, giving Margaret a warm hug. "We are so glad you decided to stay with us." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I cannot imagine being anywhere else now." Around sunset, Jake and Margaret finally escaped from the celebration and drove home to the ranch. They were both tired but happy. Margaret felt strange thinking of the ranch as her home now, but also right somehow. "Any regrets?" Jake asked as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "None at all," Margaret said. "What about you?" "Only that we waited so long to do this." They talked quietly about their plans for the future. Margaret would continue teaching at the Miller Valley School. Jake would expand his cattle operation and maybe start raising horses too. They both wanted children someday, but they were happy to take their time and enjoy being married first. "I have something for you," Jake said suddenly. He went into the house and came back with a small wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal and a fancy pen. "I thought you might want to write about your adventures," Jake said, starting with a runaway wagon and ending with a frontier wedding. Margaret was touched by his thoughtfulness. "I will start writing tonight." "What will you call your story?" Margaret thought for a moment. "How about, she was tossed from a runaway wagon. The cowboy snared her in his arms." Jake laughed. "That is a good title, very dramatic. It has been a dramatic few months." 1 year later, Margaret was sitting in the same spot on the porch writing in her journal. The school year had just ended, and she was planning lessons for the fall. The Miller Valley School now had 23 students, and the town council was talking about building a larger schoolhouse. Jake came home from checking the cattle and sat down beside her. He looked tired but satisfied. The ranch was doing well, and they had just bought more land from a neighbor who was moving to California. "What are you writing about today?" Jake asked. "I am finishing the story of how we met. I want to have it done before the baby comes." Margaret was 6 months pregnant with their first child. She had been nervous about telling Jake the news, wondering if it would bring back painful memories of Sarah. But Jake had been overjoyed and had spent weeks building a cradle and painting the nursery. "Have you decided what to do with the story when it is finished?" Jake asked. "I thought I might send it to a magazine back east. Rosa thinks other women would enjoy reading about life on the frontier." "I think Rosa is right. You are a good writer, Margaret Morrison." Margaret smiled at the sound of her married name. It still gave her a little thrill to hear it. As they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Margaret thought about how much her life had changed since that stormy day when she was thrown from the runaway wagon. She had come west looking for independence and freedom, and she had found those things. But she had also found something she had not expected: true love and a real home. She touched her growing belly and wondered what adventures waited for their child. Would their son or daughter grow up to be a rancher like Jake, or a teacher like her, or something completely different? Whatever the future held, Margaret knew their child would grow up surrounded by love and supported by a strong community. "Thank you," she said quietly to Jake. "For what?" "For catching me when I fell, in more ways than one." Jake took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you for falling into my life and making it complete again." As the first stars appeared in the Colorado sky, Margaret Morrison closed her journal and smiled. Her story had a perfect ending, but she knew it was really just the beginning of an even better adventure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, and she would face them all with Jake by her side. She had come west as a frightened runaway. She had become a confident woman, a beloved teacher, a cherished wife, and soon a mother. Most importantly, she had learned that home was not a place on a map, but wherever you found people who loved you for exactly who you were. And Margaret had definitely found her home.